They discovered her Bible within the wreckage of a Philadelphia textile factory that collapsed in 1889. The pages were swollen with rainwater, the spine irreparably cracked, yet the text remained legible. Inside the front cover, beneath the date July 4, 1863, a single line was scrawled in faded ink. "We were never meant to see freedom in this land." The woman who penned those words had survived 12 years in bondage, even after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, only to die waiting for a promise that never materialized. Today, her great-great-granddaughter stands in line at a food bank in Detroit, holding a college degree that cannot secure her a living wage, drowning in inexplicable debt, living out a cycle she cannot name. The Bible survived 6 generations. The curse survived 7. If you seek to understand why America is currently shaking at its foundations, why the economy convulses as if rejecting poison, and why every major institution is fracturing simultaneously, the answer lies not in contemporary politics, but in historical causality. This is not a matter of left versus right. It is a matter of forensic accounting. We are witnessing the compounding interest on a debt that has been accumulating for 4 years, a reckoning predicted by elders who understood that the earth possesses a memory and that divine justice keeps impeccable records. The pages are now turning. To understand the headlines, one must first understand the patterns hidden in plain sight, beginning with data points that many find uncomfortable to confront. Deuteronomy 28 is often approached selectively, with many focusing on the initial verses, detailing blessings while skimming past the subsequent. 53 verses outlining curses of staggering specificity. These verses read less like ancient theology and more like a medical examiner's report on a civilization under judgment. They served as a forensic tool designed to identify a specific people across history based on the conditions of their existence. When this blueprint is overlaid upon the history of Black America, the correspondence moves beyond coincidence into the realm of evidence. Verse 68 speaks of being brought back to a condition of bondage in ships, by a route previously unknown, to be offered for sale with no man to buy you. The transatlantic slave trade was not merely a historical tragedy. It was the fulfillment of precise criteria. Between 1525 and 1866, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in conditions of unimaginable horror. This figure excludes the millions who perished before reaching the coast, those who chose the ocean over enslavement, or those who died in the cargo holds. It remains the largest forced migration in human history, executed via ships, returning a people to a land of functional bondage where they found no redeemer. It is crucial to interpret the phrase, "no one will buy you," through its original Hebraic lens. This does not refer to purchase price. It refers to redemption. In the ancient context, a kinsman redeemer could purchase a relative out of slavery, restoring their status, land, and lineage. The curse, therefore, was not that they would go unsold as commodities. They were bought and sold relentlessly, but that no system, government, or institution would ever redeem them, restoring their stolen identity, name, history, and ancestral connection. This lack of redemption is evident through 4 centuries of chattel slavery, evolving into Jim Crow, redlining, and mass incarceration. Every attempt to establish economic independence in Tulsa, Rosewood, Wilmington, or Seneca Village was met with systematic destruction. There has been no kinsman redeemer in the political, economic, or judicial systems. The mechanisms of captivity have simply updated their aesthetic, shifting from iron chains to predatory loans, pharmaceutical pipelines, and under-resourced communities. The timing of current events is also far from arbitrary. Genesis 15:13 records a prophetic timeline stating that Abraham's descendants would be strangers in a land not their own, enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. Precision matters. The first documented arrival of enslaved Africans in English North America occurred at Point Comfort, Virginia, in 1619. Adding 400 years brings us to 2019. It is historically significant that the year following the expiration of this 400-year clock, the global order was fundamentally disrupted by a pandemic, and the public execution of George Floyd ignited worldwide unrest, dragging hidden systemic inequities into the light. If one accepts the premise of biblical accuracy, one must contend with the possibility that 2019 marked the conclusion of a prophetic timeline. The period following the expiration of such a curse is typically characterized by judgment upon the entities that administered it. Previous generations understood that a nation constructed upon stolen land, utilizing stolen labor, could not stand indefinitely. Eventually, the geopolitical books must balance. Judgment, in this context, is not necessarily apocalyptic fire. Rather, it is the removal of restraining grace, allowing corrupt systems to collapse under the weight of their own accumulated evil. America is currently experiencing this unveiling. Institutions in media, medicine, education, and finance are being exposed, revealing the machinery behind the curtain. Consider the reality sanitized by history books. The auction block in Richmond, Virginia, 1852. A woman named Sarah, already separated from her 3 children born into slavery, is subjected to invasive examination by prospective buyers assessing her breeding capacity. In that crowd stands a pastor who will preach the sanctity of life on Sunday, yet he is currently placing bids on a human being. This degradation was not an anomaly. It was the law, defended by Supreme Court rulings and theological arguments. The sin of such moments compounds over time. Every generation that built wealth upon stolen labor, without restitution, inherits that debt. The theological underpinnings of this system were established at the highest levels. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dum Diversas, authorizing the Portuguese monarchy to reduce Saracens, pagans and other enemies of Christ, to perpetual slavery. Subsequent bulls reinforced this, effectively dividing the New World and granting dominion over lands and peoples not already under Christian rule. The transatlantic slave trade possessed a theological permission slip. These documents were not formally denounced until the modern era, demonstrating that this was not merely economic opportunism, but a spiritually orchestrated dehumanization. The economic architecture erected during slavery did not vanish after 1865. It evolved. Slavery transformed into sharecropping, which segued into Jim Crow, which shifted into redlining, which evolved into modern predatory lending and mass incarceration. The operating system, extracting wealth from black bodies to maintain a specific economic hierarchy, remained constant. The 2008 housing crisis serves as a prime example. While often framed as a universal market correction based on risky subprime mortgages, data reveals targeting. Between 2005 and 2009, median black family wealth plummeted by 53%. Major financial institutions later admitted in legal settlements to intentionally steering black borrowers, qualified for prime rates into high-interest subprime loans. When the market collapsed, these institutions received government bailouts while the targeted families received eviction notices. The current erosion of trust in major institutions, banks, media, political bodies is a form of judgment. A society cannot function without a baseline of trust. We are observing real-time inflation acting as a stealth tax, supply chain fractures, and energy crises. This appears less like incompetence and more like a controlled demolition of an unsustainable system, where the debt load has become unmanageable. Historically, when empires contract, those at the bottom of the social hierarchy suffer first and most acutely. This reality necessitates a shift in strategy from integration to preparation. The biblical narrative of the Exodus provides a relevant archetype. Centuries of bondage, a cry for help that is eventually heard, divine timing, judgment upon the oppressive structure, and a subsequent transfer of wealth. The plagues of Egypt were essentially courtroom verdicts against the gods of that empire, exposing their inability to protect their adherents. The final liberation involved the Israelites plundering the Egyptians, receiving tangible resources as back pay for generations of forced labor. If the pattern holds, the current shaking of America is a prerequisite for a similar restorative justice. However, deliverance historically requires participation. Israel had to apply the blood to their doorposts and physically walk through the parted sea. Black America currently stands at a crossroads between waiting for a collapsing system to save them or beginning to construct their own ark. This is a call for wisdom similar to that of Daniel in Babylon. He survived and prospered within the empire without assimilating into its spiritual or cultural corruption. He understood their systems but never bowed to their gods, positioning himself to influence the future when the regime inevitably fell. The model involves learning the system to survive its collapse, while simultaneously building wealth, education, and food security independent of its infrastructure. The prophetic promise following judgment is not perpetual oppression, but comprehensive restoration. Amos speaks of rebuilding ruined cities and planting vineyards that will never again be uprooted, a permanent reversal of fortune. Yet, the current moment is one of disruption and exposure. The walls of the existing structure are cracking visibly. The wealth gap, political polarization, the mental health crisis, and the erosion of basic safety are all indicators of structural failure. The powers vested in maintaining this system are reacting with attempts to consolidate, control through increased digitization and surveillance, recognizing the fragility of their position. Historical precedents warn against integrating into a sinking ship. The call in Revelation 18, to come out of her, is a tactical instruction to separate emotionally, economically, and spiritually from a system facing judgment. This means divesting identity from American acceptance and ending reliance on an economy designed to ensure indebtedness. It requires viewing the situation through the lens of covenant rather than color. The biblical concept of Goshen demonstrates that it is possible to exist geographically within a territory, under judgment while remaining spiritually and practically protected. While Egypt suffered plagues and darkness, Goshen experienced peace and light. This distinction requires intentionality, fasting while others feast, saving while others spend, and building while others panic. The same shaking that dismantles oppressive systems serves to elevate those who have been marginalized. It is a divine reversal where the last become first. However, alignment with this new reality requires an internal shift. Just as ancient Israel had to shed the slave mentality of Egypt before entering the Promised Land, a psychological break from dependence on the current system is necessary. There is a temptation to measure success by proximity to institutions built on exclusion. True readiness for what comes next requires reclaiming a distinct identity and purpose that transcends current citizenship. The transition is turbulent. The old world is dying and the new one is not yet fully born. In this violent interim, one must choose between mourning the collapse of the familiar or midwifing the birth of the necessary. The elders who warned of this day understood that America was not fundamentally the land of the free, but a land built on enslavement wrapped in high-minded rhetoric. As that rhetoric unravels, those who base their identity upon it will falter, while those rooted in an eternal identity will stand. The directive is to stand firm in historical truth and spiritual identity while practically building functional alternatives, families, businesses, schools, and networks that operate independently of the crumbling infrastructure. This is the precipice between ages. Neutrality is no longer a viable option. The shaking is accelerating, and actions taken in the immediate future will determine whether one collapses with the empire or rises in the aftermath. The historical record, from the ocean floor holding the memory of the Middle Passage to the founding, documents that codified dehumanization, testifies to the necessity of this reckoning. The Constitution's 3/5 compromise was not a misunderstanding, but a calculated economic and political framework for dehumanization, often blasphemously sanctified by cherry-picked theology. The American church faces its own reckoning for centuries of complicity, preaching a gospel that accommodated slavery and Jim Crow. Judgment begins in the house of God, exposed through cascading scandals and a loss of moral authority. In contrast, the historical black church was born in resistance in the hush harbors, understanding worship as warfare and literacy as spiritual defiance. That legacy of defiance wrapped in devotion must be resurrected against a modern system that utilizes algorithms and economic pressure to induce hopelessness. The resistance required now is not necessarily kinetic but strategic. It involves becoming ungovernable by the current corrupt standards. Haiti stands as the historical proof of concept that organized black resistance can overthrow entrenched power, which is why it has been punished geopolitically for 2 centuries. The modern equivalent of military occupation is economic encirclement and digital distraction designed to prevent unity. Countering this requires building parallel economies. If a significant percentage of the $1.6 trillion annual black spending power was redirected exclusively toward black-owned entities, It would create an economic fortress capable of funding autonomous infrastructure. This requires the discipline of delayed gratification, similar to the 381-day Montgomery bus boycott, which utilized economic withdrawal to force systemic change. The current season is one of preparation, much like Joseph's 13 years in Egyptian prisons before his elevation to power. It is a stripping away of dependence to train for stewardship. The question is whether this time is being used to complain or to build. Like Esther, positioned in a hostile palace for a specific crisis, there is a mandate to use current access and resources to advocate for and protect the community, realizing that silence will not guarantee safety when judgment falls. The empire is demonstrating clear signs of terminal decline, from currency debasement to military overextension. As empires fall, they often scapegoat their most vulnerable populations. Survival requires acknowledging that the collapsing system was designed for extraction, not flourishing. Detaching from the desire for its validation is painful but necessary for spiritual survival. The coming years will likely see intense polarization and the exposure of compromised leadership. The choice is between remaining a consumer in a failing state or becoming a builder of a new kingdom. The elders chose resistance when it meant death, passing a baton of endurance and faith to the current generation. This generation is the answer to centuries of prayers, destined to rebuild on the ruins. The pressure being applied through refusal to accept lies and commitment to building independent structures is accelerating the necessary collapse. When the dust settles, only edifices built on solid foundations will remain. The time for patience with oppression has passed. The time for strategic, spiritually rooted disruption has arrived. Choose this day which side of history you will occupy as the waters of judgment close.